Seen me up here hanging out, telling some jokes, and I have a podcast called Mycopreneur Podcast. I like to roast white people in the psychedelic space. It's so easy, low-hanging fruit everywhere, so that's kind of what I do.
Wonderful. Yeah, check out his videos. My name is Joe Moore, CEO, co-founder of Psychedelics Today. I've been in the psychedelic space about 2 decades. We have been operational at Psychedelics Today for nearly 7 years. We've got 4.4 million downloads. We've got about 12,000 people enrolled in our booming.
Thanks, Joe. My name is Cynthia Salarizada. I am the founder of Globe for Alternative Industries and Emerging Technologies. I'm also the co-founder of Green Market Report, which was recently sold to Cranes Communication, which is a cannabis and psychedelics news source specific to finance and business. And then I'm also the co-founder to El Planteo, which is a Spanish cannabis and psychedelics lifestyle publication. So that's who I am when it comes to cannabis and psychedelics and media. Josiah?
Thanks. My name is Josiah Hesse. I'm a journalist, freelancer. I've been contributing to Guardian and Vice for about 8 years. I've been reporting on cannabis for maybe 15 years. Moved to Denver about 20 years ago, and so I saw the whole arc of decriminalization to legalization there, and in the fall of
mentioned your book Runner's High, and there's often a stigma that a lot of the how have you covered that, and have you seen that as a challenge? And I want to open it up to everyone to talk about the challenges that they've seen in covering this space.
Yeah, it was a real serendipitous opportunity for me because of that stigma. I came from a sort of rural, religious, fundamentalist environment in Iowa, and when I moved to Denver, didn't have any education, didn't have any background in journalism. But there were a lot of decriminalization. Eventually a civic legalization measure, and while all this was happening, journalists were suddenly forced to cover cannabis, and they a kind of ignorance. Like anytime a journalist would give a report on cannabis, anytime between like 2000 to 2015, they would finish every statement with, "But I don't know that much. This isn't my beat," and they really didn't want to ruin their reputation by associating themselves with this subject, which is weird because, I mean, in no other topic, if you're reporting on like healthcare or, you know, the war in Iraq, you wouldn't finish it with saying, "But I don't know that much about it. You know, this isn't really for me." I knew a lot about it, so I could, you know, raise my hand and be like, "I'll take that story. I'll report." So there was a real opportunity the resume to warrant that access. It just, but that changed over the last, I don't know, 5-6 years, where we started words like terpenes and talk about the ballot measures with some kind of sophistication.
You know, we're so lucky to have folks like you who are covering for mainstream outlets, but there's such you guys all the time, right? Like I am. And one of the panelists mentioned getting up, listening, reading the trades every day. And so I know, Cynthia, you've actually founded some of these, the biggest trades now. Can you talk about how that addressed the challenge?
Yeah, I actually founded all of the publications that I did. Public relations professional at heart. That's what I do. And when I came into cannabis, I couldn't even put a press release out with the term marijuana or cannabis on it. So PR Newswire, Business Wire, Globe Newswire, all of them, I went and actually I didn't bring up because I don't care to these days. It's not a big part of it, but it is market report. So we couldn't get anybody to cover business or finance within mainstream media. So I went and found Deborah Borchardt, who was the only female financial journalist, the only financial journalist, by the way, who was touching the topic, and she was still with, who was she with?
Forbes.
She was with Forbes. And so I went and I partnered up with her and asked her if she wanted to go down this path with me. And we did, and it was regular world outside of cannabis and now psychedelics doesn't make that much money, and they don't have smaller than a regular mainstream publication. So not only were we working to launch a niche category, our goal was to just remain as trustworthy as possible and make sure that all of our coverage was as accurate as it could be. Now it's one of the top publications covering these industries in the world. And it was created out of emergence, out of necessity.
So we've talked to a couple folks who have kind of based your work in cannabis, and I know you're also looking at psychedelics, and then we have a couple of folks, I think you kind of come from the psychedelic space, and you know, you've seen this kind of heat building around the psychedelics aspects, and there's been a lot of amazing press out there, but there's also been kind of scandalous press. Actually, the previous panel mentioned Prince Harry and his, the British press saying that he's glorifying it. Dennis, anything you want to just touch on about that?
Totally. Yeah, the press is going to do what the press is going to do. Onto anything negative that happens, right? That's just a reality. And I think really that's where independent platforms can come in. Someone like Psychedelics Today or myself, Mycopreneur, and provide really credible coverage that's factual and that, you know, isn't so bound to a really corporatized narrative, if you will. And, you know, I wanted to echo in DMT and taking classes with Academy Award-winning filmmakers at USF. So like for me, you know, 15 years plus into this game, I'm extremely comfortable, and also, you know, to extend upon that, to look at the social media ecosystem. I think that's really something we need to focus on, because like for the younger generation, Gen Z, they're getting 50% plus of their news from TikTok, right? They're using that for search, etc. Right, in places. So that's something that I personally focus on a lot, because I think moving forward, conversation, press, et cetera, is coming from the social media. So when I see bad press or something, it's my obligation to inject my perspective into it, is the way that I feel, and to say, okay, well, for example, I just got to go down to Brazil with The Last of Us, the production, right, from HBO. They've got everyone talking about cordyceps now, and it's a very negative portrayal of cordyceps. Like, cordyceps are going to turn you into a zombie and they're evil. Well, you know what that does is it drives cordyceps. Really, this is going to be a collaboration between independent media like Psychedelics Today, Mycopreneur, shout out Lucid News, lots of. The other side of that is maybe there's unabashed exuberance, and they're promoting all these, take psychedelics and it cures depression. And, I have a lot of bones to pick with that narrative. I think it's really somewhere in the middle. So that's all I'll say on the subject. Thank you.
Joe, do you have anything to add about your coverage?
Yeah, so when we started 7 years ago, nobody really was talking about this. And it was very fringe. So $8 million annually, and it's been really interesting to watch the mainstream narratives develop, and stuff as if they are, and they are absolutely not. So the way a lot of these stories are portrayed is really, really not great. It's okay from the hype perspective. I'm of the thought that anything we can do to fight the DEA is important. Anything we can do to fight for our independence is important. So we need to, really be working these narratives, and what. Secretly forever, and now, oh, okay, cool, I'm not as kooky as you thought I was, huh? I took it really seriously for a long time, and it's nice to see this kind of new development and getting validation from mainstream outlets, institutions, investors, governments, etc.
Do you see any sort of outgrowth of, will you be covering the cannabis industry at all?
In cannabis from our perspective, and then also cannabis-assisted psychotherapy, which isn't really getting enough press, but that is coming, and we would cover it from that perspective because it's somewhat adjacent to psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies.
Telling me earlier that that's kind of spurred a new need from your listeners and the people who want a platform to talk about.
Totally. So yeah, a bunch of people from cannabis started hitting me up to get on my mushroom podcast. And I was like, yeah, that's cool, but like, I don't know where it fits. It's kind of taking me out of the wheelhouse. And I really enjoy talking. I don't know if you can pick up on that. So I figured, I'll just start a second podcast. And really what I wanted to hone in on is the angle of cannabis tourism, which actually for me, it's an opportunity to tie into this idea about the drug war, which Joe and I are in alignment in a lot of ways about, that I think the media should unanimously congregate to defeat the DEA. And I think that's like a huge central legalized recreationally. South Africa, Uruguay. Come in, and we told these countries that cannabis was illegal in the first place. Like, cannabis has, millennia foreign policy and State Department. And so I think that's where the education comes in, where it's like, I can do fun satire videos and kind of like pop culture references to hook people in, but then really I want to bake in a lot of these more serious topics and try to make them approachable. looking at like a global industry. And I think personally, a lot of people don't recognize how global these industries are going to be, where you have certain brands that are, you know, getting into a dozen foreign markets already. And Cynthia can talk a lot more about that. But I think it's our duty, if we're involved in this industry, to be as educated as possible, and right, and to be as approachable as possible, and also to not be so rigid in our views, because new information might come.
Some trends. Looking at now, what do you like? What are you looking for? What do you?
Terpenes and flavonoids and THC volume and the kind of whole spectrum of effects that you can get from cannabis, because the endocannabinoid system it's like a Swiss Army knife for the body. It regulates you know, pretty much anything that's happening to you, your appetite, your fertility, your mood, your sleep. So within that diversity, there's a whole lot of diversity in how the plant. And on a selfish, personal note, I'd love to see a more sophisticated conversation about athletics and fitness when it comes to cannabis, because what we saw, you know, just before and shortly after the book came out, Brittany Griner was arrested for cannabis in Russia, and the kind of pushback. Think that cannabis has any positive and of course WADA shouldn't be banning this as a performance enhancer, because it depletes your performance. It must, and you know, both sides of that argument are well, and even the prohibition of it in and of itself is a kind of misnomer of a conversation, but we need to really sort of drill down into all the nuance.
Crowd check. How many of you guys are here from the cannabis industry? And how many from the psychedelics? And how many both? And how many neither? Thank you for that. It's about half and half. And, you know, there are so many important causes, you know, I'm interested to or more of that big J kind of journalism aspect, like that you're behind and you really want to see moved forward.
Okay, I do have something to say on that. I'm only in this industry because unfortunately my little brother, who was my best friend and we shared a birthday, kind of set me on this path, which started out professionally pulled over to that industry to do what I did in cannabis over in psychedelics, but in reality see that I was doing all of this for something because cannabis wasn't getting that part done. But I'm really excited about the opportunity that these particular compounds do offer for those types of issues. So I would say I'm an advocate. I've literally dedicated my life to trying to make sure that other families don't go through what my family went through, and their family.
I mean, do you have a sense that it's getting any better? Yes. I mean,
some reason, is still considered like a trashy, criminal, it's just got a... As soon as psychedelics launched, first off, the red team, the Republicans, are like at the front, and I'm sure that's what makes it so much different and a lot more palatable in a professional sense, but psychedelics is what's...
I consider myself more of an activist whenever, or advocate too. Like when I think of the word journalist, it's absolutely not what I do. I think we need to pull no... Breckenridge, Colorado, we had 9 people in 9 days die very recently from contaminated drug supply. So I am endlessly being an activist to help end the drug war. It's just not okay. It's harmed so many people. Unconscionable to me to be some sort of objective, it's not the right word. You might help me with this, Josiah, but like objective journalist seems like a fiction in this kind of weird war we find ourselves in. But maybe I'll let you comment.
Well, I'm somewhat cynical about the idea of an objective truth, but I think the pursuit of that truth is worthwhile and noble. You do the state, and whenever I am reporting on cannabis or psychedelics, I actually pursue the detractors and want to give them a platform and want to show a balance. Probably one of the chief detractors of the legalization movement, and he's a very intelligent person. I disagree with him on a lot of points, but I often call him up whenever I'm reporting on anything happening in cannabis or other people, just because I don't want to be any kind of propagandist. And I think that's a role that the industry needs and should play, but journalists also need to hold people accountable.
Good point. Anything else to add? For startups, are you more interested in speaking with sort of the corporations? Are you looking for the science aspects? What is your ideal subject?
I'll take it away. I take meetings with everyone. Last night I had a meeting with like some underground heavyweights who aren't even part of the conference, and then today I get to hang out with people like Dustin Robinson and Kevin Harrington and all that. So for me, if you don't like it or if it doesn't make sense to you, and if it does, then you run with it. So I'm a big advocate for cast a the socio-political spectrum we're dealing with right now in the U.S. and worldwide is just so far left and so far right. So I try to get information from everyone so as not to have these echo chambers, right? Or, these different siloed off viewpoints. And that's really what I try to do is like embrace divergent perspectives, because moving forward and thinking about the role of the media, we're going to have increasingly divergent perspectives on a lot of things. So what we really need, I think, is people who are able to from your perspective. And then the last bit I'll add to this, homogenized journalism. And we see this a lot with Prince Harry tripped, but where are these, more divergent, more skeptical perspectives? And that's really the role I thank you for that chance to talk.
Yeah, and you're going to dig in and ask those tough questions. Yeah.
As you should.
There's so many important things we need to dig into like that. There's so many.
I'm from New Jersey, I'll cuss.
fuckery,
Watch what I
fuckery
put in
happening in the industry, in the psychedelic. I saw a lot of stuff that looked like straight up fraud. And get people very educated so that they can be independent thinkers and make up their mind on, where should I put my money, into myself in training, into myself in, my portfolio or whatever. How do you know that this transdermal psilocybin patch is actually going to make it through the FDA? And should somebody put their life savings in that company? Maybe not. Maybe you should go into 20 companies, not just one.
Well, before you go investing in that company, take a look at Green Market Report, because we do dig into all their financials and let you know exactly what you need to know.
We won't name that company.
So are you about looking at the countries that tourism or psychedelics tourism? Do you want to be hyper-local? Do you want to see? And do you have any predictions for us on what you're seeing and hearing maybe, or tracking?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that one more time?
So basically, are you more interested in hyper-local stories? You said you're based in Denver. I'm sure you're here in Miami, whatnot. Are you interested in what's going on in your backyard, or are you watching geopolitical stories that you're?
Curiosity can strike in any landscape. I think when it is hyper-local, you have a leg up. Like as a freelance journalist, I'm kind of competing with other journalists for the best story and the most unique story. And so if there is in DC, talking to politicians and lobbyists and interns, then I don't really feel qualified, but then at the same time, if no one else is reporting on it, I'll definitely give it a shot. When it comes to psychedelic tourism, it's something that I think we really need to progress as quickly as possible, because there really isn't enough really know what they're doing. People really just think that I've heard this from guides, that they're not a guide, that the medicine is the guide, and they take a step back from everything, and all you need to do is just to administer it to people, and the rest will figure itself out. And that's something that really, you need. Dangerous, not only for the people. This is what people are trying to do.
But I would say that I think this has to be done in the mainstream, so it has to be done on a massive scale. But I think really the experiences are pretty local. I mean, you're going to Peru, Costa Rica, Jamaica, and I think they're pretty local stories. But the requirement right now is we need it to be an international story, so more people are involved and we can make them accountable for how they are guiding people or whatever shamanistic efforts they're making. But I do think it's hyper-local, but on an international scale, so both. I agree.
What kind of responsibility do you guys feel that you have as gatekeepers? You guys all have a very wide audience. And, again, I go back to this word stigma. It's not the best word, but there's a fear in, the bedroom communities. What responsibility do you guys have a sense or feel responsible
I really vet a bit carefully who I put on our platform because they get a lot of power out of being platformed. You know, how many folks have been on Forbes or, you know, Business Insider that haven't really kind of deserved that attention, you know? So, you know, you can pay for attention totally, but great. But we need people of smaller audience size, you know, smaller players to get platformed. So I'll regularly find young to speak at a conference yet, or facilitators from wherever, shamans from wherever. So it's, I feel a responsibility for giving the smaller individuals a voice, especially, you know, when there's folks out there with tons of power just constantly. Our independent, like smaller platforms, we have that power.
Yeah, I want to build off of that and just say that that's something that I baked into the strategy of Mycopreneur from day one, is to get as many diverse and globalized perspectives as possible. And I'm very proud to say that the metrics for last month, Mycopreneur podcast had listeners in 48 countries, and we've platformed mycopreneurs from 25 countries, I believe, including sub-Saharan Africa, Uganda, including places like the Maldives, just like really, you know, countries where you don't hear these perspectives. And I made a list of 23 mushroom brands to watch in 2023, and without even trying, over half of them out in India from Bangalore that I put on the list, how much that meant to them and how many people in that organization reached out to me. Whereas some of the bigger companies I put on just like, whatever, you know, I don't care. So I think, like, you know, platforming those independent out the ecosystem, because moving forward, like, we need an ecosystem with psychedelics, right? You don't need this sort of like a robust ecosystem, and to do that you have to apply to independent platforms.
I love that.
But we do have a responsibility to continue to make sure we're not platforming the wrong people. So Green Market Report has a responsibility. In the beginning, nobody really understood what they were investing in, honestly, and the industry required so much investment for research, for foundational reasonings, what we needed investment. So we needed someone to go out there and figure out who were the companies that were doing it the right way, who was trustworthy, and who was bullshit. And that's not easy to do, and it does not make you the most popular person in the room, but we did our job, and a lot of people made healthy and we can only move as quick as we can, but I believe that these trade publications have a responsibility to highlight what's right and wrong.
Yeah, I'll just jump in on that. I absolutely feel a responsibility when it comes to educating readers on psychedelics or cannabis, because there is so much. It's either a pep rally for this stuff, like it's good 100% of the time for all people in all contexts, or, you know, the other side that just wants to demonize it 100% of the time. And when people are getting into cannabis and they go into a dispensary, there's an incredible lack of education on the part of the bud tenders in terms of, you know, talking to people like, what are you using this for? What's your experience level with cannabis? I mean, we especially saw this in the early days of Denver. People were showing up to the ER in these massive numbers because they were going in it since the 70s, and yeah, they lose their mind. Maureen Dowd wrote a whole column about it. She was freaking out in her hotel room. At that, it's like, well, don't take 100 milligrams. You know, maybe you should start with 5 or 10. You know, take it slowly. So I'm just going to eat a half an ounce of mushrooms and go wander around in the mountains for a day, and, you know, then it's all going to disappear. And falls to journalists, and a lot of journalists just aren't doing that work.
I think that's a really and also just the real difference between earned media versus but you guys have this really great opportunity to tell that's very unique. I don't know if there's anything else you guys would want to add or anything that I missed before I open. Any questions in the room?
We need more media outlets.
We
so
need, oh,
keep
do
going.
we? Well, talk to me about that, because you have, and like, let's just go one more time around the panel as to, you know, really the different channels that you're reaching your folks, because we do know, like, most of us wake Twitter, Facebook, and the kids are getting it from TikTok, whatnot. But a lot of us are checking those headlines on our social media platforms. So what channels are most compelling to you? And yeah.
If we're talking specific platforms here, I'll throw another plug for Psychedelics Today. Like, they've shaped a lot of my thinking. You know, when it's some Victoria say anything about this, and so that one, Lucid News, is one I totally pay attention to, and I also write for them, but they've I'd shout them out. There's a whole bunch of other ones coming into the space, and you know, I think that's good. You know, I'm not anti-corporate in any sense. Like, I was out in a boat in the bay yesterday. That shit was awesome, you know? So all I'm saying is that I think, like, it's good to get your news from a broad cross-section so you can think about things. And what I'm concerned about at large in the United States and beyond is people who just only get their news from one outlet. And like, as bipartisan as that goes, that creates so many problems. And like, the too.
We're launching 2 media outlets around Oregon exclusively. And kind of a policy-focused one, so that will be, I believe, really influential. We've already been super influential in Oregon, influencing policy. So I believe we can do the same in Colorado over the next 18 months if we pay attention and provide them really good insight that's grounded in some sort of reality. So we will also be launching a Colorado segment. And yeah, there's just it's never been cheaper and easier to launch a media platform. It's always going to be hard to execute, but you know, that's the cost. It's next to free to launch. It's pretty expensive.
International in scope. It'll include international cannabis, psychedelics, and Web3.
Love it.
Yeah, I get a lot of, I guess, what would be characterized as mainstream media, Washington Post, New York Times, and then publications I work for, The Guardian and Vice. I am, you know, champion of old school. You just really try and avoid being a champion. I'm not saying it's an easy thing to nail down the truth.
I love hearing that.
The only counterpoint is just the death toll from the drug war for me. So that's why I color it.
Yeah. Do we have any questions?
Hi, I'm Kim. I'm actually from Denver as well. You're from Denver? Your best advice for actually getting media pickup without doing necessarily a press release. I mean, sent them beautiful boxes full of stuff and handwritten letters. I'm like, surely they'll want to write a story about my brands. I have Yeah, well, what if we're poor? Because we're like, I
Slowly
mean,
and carefully building relationships, I think.
in what way?
Any way
Like
you
here,
can.
like meeting people like, hi.
Any way you can, right?
Social media.
Social media.
I would start addressing them via very short with really catchy subject line, but you need a friend in PR who has the relationships. What you're not getting through is Josiah will open my email because it's me. That's
Right.
it.
Yeah.
If I was some random publicist or journalist on the, Josiah is never looking at that. It doesn't matter how many times you try, it's the relationships, and that's what you pay for with a public. So you pay. Everything I've tried to create platforms for brands and individuals to pitch us to get things moving along quicker.
Just randomly send stuff to a reporter. Make sure that they actually ask for it first. I think I'm saying this as a publicist, but I
No,
think
expand
you
on that.
guys would agree with me. Like, you want to know.
If it's acid, maybe.
Yeah, I would
got
say
you.
that's a hard pass. But I would make sure they actually. World. Another lower cost option may be to find a hungry young comms grad who knows what they're doing and wants to break into the industry, because when you're young and hungry, you work 24/7.
I mean, I just want to jump on that. With publicity, you kind of are doing the role of journalism, and journalists need stories. So you are the industry and what is news and what isn't news. You can craft a press release that will get people's attention. I agree, with Cynthia and others that most press releases go into the trash, but I always do read. Most find a way to frame it in a subject line, you can get a journalist's attention. And also, I think, as helpful as social media definitely is, and I'm on social media a lot, and I do interact with a lot of publicists through that, there really isn't anything that beats face-to-face contact. I've had an office above this vegan restaurant. Whenever a publicist or somebody who is looking to get their name in the media wants to meet up with me, I'm like, oh, we'll go down there and have a cup of coffee, and it's really not an inconvenience for me to take 30 minutes, 45 minutes to go downstairs and have a cup of coffee with someone, but that will be more memorable, and it will give you the opportunity to feed someone unique information that'll, grab them.
It is a challenge, and it's nothing you're doing wrong. It is nothing you're doing wrong. It's process, and it doesn't seem to work. You gotta find the people with the relationships.
I feel like all the places that I have paid for the press releases, they're like, oh no, it's too misleading, because I am in both cannabis and now in mushrooms as well. They're like, oh no, you can't say that. And I rewrite it like 20 times, and then it's like super boring sounding. I'm like, why did I spend all this money on these press releases? Because they're like, oh, you can't make it sound like you're selling psilocybin. Sorts of levels to navigate, but thank you. Sorry.
There's certainly some spaces for, press releases. I've heard for 25 years, press release is dead. It'll never be dead. But there's a time and a place for a press release, and there's a time and a place for a 3-sentence email to someone with the takeaways and keeping it short and sweet. So, and I see.
Is about, you're talking about like introducing more diversity of opinion and industry, but how do we do that while also fighting the war on drugs? Because there's kind of like competing ideas to an extent, and I'm not on one side of the fence or other, but like, how do you align and work together? Curating divergent opinions that create holistic culture.
It's hard is the simple answer. The complex answer is events like this, getting thing to make it really quick. The real enemy here is not your competition in this space. The real enemy is like insurance companies, pharma, et cetera, and the DEA.
I have one thing to say. Psychedelic reporters as of now. Every reporter is normally covering both cannabis and psychedelics, and I know a lot of psychedelics brands and operators find that to be offensive. This is not our fault. Please, for the love of God. We will soon be there. For now, Josiah will handle it.
Well, and our friend Shayla Love at Vice is doing some excellent psychedelic
Shayla, I've got
reporting.
Dennis, I've got us all.
Yeah, we're working to hire our first full-time reporter in the near future, so we will have like actual journalism. We hope.
But it took a minute for us to do that, though, right? I mean, it takes a second, and Business Insider just hired their psychedelics writer. Forbes doesn't. Write on your psychedelics story. Don't be offended if you have a cannabis known journalist writing your psychedelics. You're welcome. They're the only ones who can handle it. Stop.
I'll keep them coming. So the follow-up question, like, So I'm in the media industry. We have the largest psychedelic and CBD advertising firm called Lucid. Audience while also making sure that your integrity with your content is there. Especially when you're saying like, it's hard to hire and have the funding for these quality people to be writing about these topics. Like, what does that challenge look like? And
That is a huge challenge, and that was a good question. I bootstrapped Green Market Report. We never raised $1. And luckily, I'm a publicist, so I was like, holy shit, what do I do? How do I let the world know that we exist? What I did was questionable in its integrity, and I'll say why. I went and I teamed up with a data company. I went and sifted through everything, and what I found was that cannabis consumers who spend more than $100 in cannabis a month prefer certain fast foods. So 5 years ago when I launched Green Market Report, I came out with this study that cannabis consumers prefer McDonald's, second was Taco Bell, third was like Jack in the Box. Well, I went viral in 12 different countries in 9 languages overnight, and the whole world knew that Green Market Report now existed. I did that with $0, and it just required creativity. That was it. So creativity is how you get around all of our restrictions. It's how you get around all the nonsense that we deal with, and that was how I did it. I took data and put out a study. Hustle.
And I think to refine that, like, how do you optimize for integrity in what you're creating while optimizing for reach? And like, I hear your point with like the virality.
I had to sacrifice. I either kept the story that cannabis consumers had nothing to do with.
But that is a dilemma that a lot of journalists and editors face, because ultimately you're running a business with these publications, and you need to get hits on each story in order to justify the money that you're putting into it. And it's going to get a lot of people's attention. It might not be true, but that's something that a lot of publicists encounter. But then once you start digging into the actual research, you're like, well, that's a pretty hyperbolic conclusion to come to. I'm ultimately selling every story to these editors, and a gray line to walk in terms of, making sure that it's substantive. And
course, or I don't know, they teach it in colleges, and I drove the McDonald's stock up billions of dollars for 2 days.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Oh, we're done? Thank you, everyone.
thank you.
It's been fun.
Thank you. Yo, the next panel, hop up here. I'm emceeing too. I don't know how many of y'all were here this morning. I've had a chance to work on my comedy routine. It's been good. All right, so yes, hi. Whoever's ready, whoever's here, let's rock and roll. Let's keep this ship sailing. So next roll is about the rise of the psychedelic clinic. We should keep Joe Moore.